What's up, you guys, and welcome to my channel. Before we get into today's video, I just had two things that I wanted to go over really quickly. The first thing is that today's video is going to be the first video in my Halloween series. So every Wednesday and Saturday, we will be looking at cases that took place on or around Halloween, with the week leading up to it being a full week of true crime content. Now, here's where I need your help. I need a name. I don't know what to call this series on my video. I've thought of Fright Nights, and that's pretty much as far as I've gotten. When I searched Fright Nights, it was actually revealed that it was a movie that I've never seen. But I'm also a giant chicken and don't really like Halloween movies. Don't come at me. And the final thing, starting in November, I will be reading a true crime book every month and then doing a video surrounding that case at the end of the month. I don't know what I'm going to be reading for November yet. I'm thinking about The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule. I know I've never read it before. So if you guys want to read along with me and discuss your thoughts, be sure to follow me on Instagram, where I will be posting that kind of information. Now, I may branch out eventually and read some fiction books that were based on true crime cases, like Gone Girl was based on the Lacey Peterson case. And then I read another book a while back that was based on the Amanda Knox case. I have to do more research into those before I start that, though. So for right now, it's just going to be true crime, and I hope you guys will join me in reading some of these books and even leave your suggestions on what I should read in the comments. Halloween is many people's favorite time of the year. When you're younger, you can go gather candy and carve your pumpkins. And as you age, you spend more time with friends, going to costume parties, dressing up. But what happens when a night of partying potentially turns dangerous? Today, we are going to be discussing the case of Cindy Song. Young Jung Song, more commonly known as Cindy, was born in Seoul, South Korea on February 25th of 1980. Now, she was very open and willing to try new things, but she was also fiercely independent and dedicated to her studies. In 1995, she would actually move from South Korea to go and live with her aunt and uncle in Virginia so she could attend high school there and then focus on going to a good college. When she was in high school, she was focused on her grades as well as athletics. She ran track and played tennis, and by all accounts, she did really well in school. It was also during her teenage years that she discovered her passion for the arts. Anything from photography to dance to painting, anything that was creative. When Cindy enrolled in Penn State, she was able to take her passion for the arts with her and decided to major in integrative arts, which is a very student-focused major. It allows them to pick out what classes they want to study, to bring in outside experience, things along those lines, and Cindy loved it. In the fall of 2001, Cindy was actually a senior at Penn State. She would be graduating that coming spring. Now, along with her class schedule, she was also working two part-time restaurant jobs, and she had her own off-campus apartment with her roommate named Catherine. And even though Cindy was determined and dedicated to her studies, there was still one night of the year where she could just let her hair down and be a typical college kid and have some fun. That was Halloween. So on Wednesday, October 31st, Cindy and her friends Stacy and Lisa were going to go to this costume party at the Players nightclub and just celebrate Halloween, have some fun, let their hair down, just have a good time. Now, Cindy loved to look cute. She didn't dress provocatively. That really wasn't her style. It was more kind of, girl next door kind of cute. So that night, she decided she was going to dress as a bunny. And she had her little bunny ears on. She had a pink shirt with a bunny logo, a white tennis skirt, some brown suede knee-high boots, a little tail, some sheer tights, and then to go over this, when they were going to the club, she was wearing a red jacket. So the three girls would party until the club shut down at 2 a.m., and then they decided they didn't want their night to be over quite yet. So they went over to a friend's house and played some video games until around 4 a.m. on November 1st. They weren't drunk, they were just kind of tipsy and enjoying themselves. So Stacy decides that she's going to take Cindy back to her apartment building. And Cindy gets out of the car, says goodbye to Stacy, and the two depart in separate directions. Now, Stacy said that she did not stay to see if Cindy made it into her apartment or not. And unfortunately, this was the last confirmed sighting of Cindy Song. Later in the day, on November 1st, Cindy's roommate Catherine actually arrived back to the apartments. She'd been visiting her family in Philadelphia, and she was eager to talk to Cindy and catch up, see how she had been. And she actually thought that they had plans to do that, but when she arrived back, the apartment was empty. The days continued to pass in November with no sign of Cindy. She wasn't at home, she wasn't showing up to classes, and she wasn't going to work. When she actually missed a shift that Saturday at the Seoul Korean Garden restaurant, her friends got extremely concerned and decided that they would place a missing persons report. Now, because Cindy was reported missing on the weekend, the call actually went to patrol officers. They couldn't really do much, but they said that they would leave the tip on investigator Brian Sprinkle's desk. So he came in to work on Monday and he saw Cindy's case. He reviewed the information and then he went to her apartment. So because Cindy was reported missing on Saturday, November 3rd, the call went to patrol officers. They really couldn't do much, but they said that they would put it on lead investigator Brian Sprinkle's desk, and he would review it when he got into work the following Monday. So Monday rolls around, and Brian comes into work. He sees Cindy's file, and he begins reviewing it. He starts by going over to Cindy's apartment and conducting a search. So when investigator Sprinkle gets over to Cindy's apartment, he theorizes that she must have left on her own. There is the evidence that the door was locked when Catherine returned. There's no sign of a struggle inside the apartment. And there are things that Cindy left behind. So on the bathroom counter were the fake eyelashes she wore on Halloween, and her backpack and cell phone were also found in the apartment. Now, Cindy's friends said that even though this was 2001 and people thought differently about cell phones back then, she would never leave her cell phone behind. She very much liked to stay in contact with people and would never leave without telling someone where she was going. What wasn't found in the apartment, however, was Cindy's purse, which contained her wallet with her ID and credit cards inside, as well as her keys. Evidence also points to her still wearing her bunny costume because the ears and the tail were not found either. So just down the road from Cindy's apartment was this 24-hour convenience store, and Cindy was known to visit there quite frequently at odd hours. She would go early in the morning, late at night. Just whenever she really needed something, she would walk down there, pick it up, and return home. Investigators theorized that she must have been heading there just for a quick stop. So investigators started there. They went to this convenience store and they asked to see the surveillance camera footage. And guess what they were told? They were told that the footage from the early morning hours of November 1st had been recorded over because, it's 6 days later at this point. Why would there still be footage from so many days ago? You can't really blame them, but it just always seems to happen in these cases, is that surveillance footage that could be pivotal to a case has been deleted. Now, the investigation team reached out to Cindy's family, who were still living in Seoul at this time, and informed them of their daughter's disappearance. The first thing that the investigators needed to do was determine if she had walked away on her own or had met with foul play. And the first step that they took was determining her mental health. Could she have left on her own? Could she have needed to get away from it all for whatever reason? They actually found that Cindy lived with her boyfriend in the apartment until September, when he abruptly broke up with her and moved out. And her family thought that this could have been a reason why she would have left or even taken her own life. But her friends quickly said that this was not Cindy. She wouldn't just go away or even take her own life. Yes, she did struggle when her and her boyfriend initially broke up, but she was going to therapy and was taking medication for her mental health. And by all accounts, she was doing really well. She'd gotten over the initial shock of being dumped essentially and was continuing on with her life. And the search of Cindy's apartment supported her friend's theory that she did not take her own life. She had just purchased a brand new computer. There were tickets for an upcoming Britney Spears concert in her apartment, and she had applied for a graphic design internship that following spring. So Cindy was making plans. This wasn't indicative of someone committing suicide or just simply having too much and running away. So investigators quickly ruled out the theory that she had taken her own life. So with that lead closed, investigators turned to Cindy's diary, thinking that it could tell them, more about what was going on in her life during this time. And it did, to an extent. In her diary, Cindy had written that she had experimented with ecstasy and marijuana. So the police were like, well, maybe this was a drug angle. Maybe something happened, because of this. However, her friends said that when they went out on Halloween, there were no drugs taken, and that the times that Cindy wrote about experimenting were just that, experiments. They said that it was just a typical college student trying new things, getting the full college experience. And once again, investigators agreed with them and quickly ruled out the drug angle. So now they had two things off the table. They were pretty confident that Cindy didn't take her own life, and they were pretty confident as well that drugs really didn't play a factor. But other than that, they were stuck. They had no leads. They interviewed everyone in Cindy's life, including her ex-boyfriend, and everyone came back clean. No one had a reason to harm Cindy. So a few days after Cindy's friends had reported her missing, there was a woman that called in a tip that said she thought she had seen Cindy in Philadelphia's Chinatown district. This is 200 miles away from State College, the town where Cindy lived. And, investigators are desperate at this point. They're like, okay, we have to follow every single tip we get on this case. If she says that she saw Cindy, we have to go check it out. So they interviewed this woman, and she said she was just walking along when she passed a car. And in the car, there was a woman that matched Cindy's description. She was crying and screaming for help. And as the woman was trying to get a closer look as to what was going on, a man came around and told her to get lost, to mind her own business. So she quickly scampered away, but she did call in the tip to law enforcement. A sketch was provided to police, and they were out looking for this man. However, as time went on, the credibility in this tip began to diminish. The woman's story kept changing, and it changed so many times that eventually police ruled this out as a possible lead. As the days went by with no new information, police began to examine Cindy's cell phone and kept a close eye on her credit card records. Her cell phone didn't show any unusual behavior before she left that evening. She had no incoming or outgoing calls after Stacy dropped her off, and her credit cards were silent. They were not being used at all. During this time, Cindy's family actually arrived from South Korea. Her mother and her brother showed up to help with the investigation. And while they were there, like so many people in their situation, they couldn't just sit idly by. They had to find some way to help. Now, there are only so many leads that were coming in at this point in time, and while they were trying to track down every single lead and follow it to the end, they also needed more to do. So Cindy's family actually cleaned her apartment and eliminated anything that could have been potentially picked up. Now, at this time, the apartment was not declared a crime scene. They thought Cindy had left and whatever happened to her had to have happened outside of the apartment. But this just kind of rubbed investigators wrong, which started the negative relationship between them and the Song family. So while the investigation had shifted its focus to foul play, the tensions between the investigators and the Song family were growing increasingly higher. The Song family thought that the police were not doing enough to find Cindy, and the police thought that, they needed to focus more on finding Cindy than on dealing with the family. And this all came to a head when Cindy's family, along with the Coalition for the Search for Cindy Song, held a press conference. Now, the Coalition was a group of people that were assembled at the college, I believe. So a lot of students on campus, a lot of people with interest in finding Cindy. But they held this press conference and basically openly criticized the police. They said, just what I said before, that they weren't doing enough. Her brother said that he didn't understand, the legal procedures that the police were having to follow and criticized them for that. They also mentioned the disappearance of a 13-year-old girl a few years before this and said that the FBI had already sent numerous agents by that point, and they wondered why the same was not being done for Cindy. So at this point, communications between the Song family and the investigators came to a crashing halt. They would not communicate directly with each other anymore. However, there was one party that was very actively communicating with the family, and that was Penn State. They were helping Cindy's mom by giving her free room and board, giving her free access to the internet, just so she could focus on finding her daughter while she was in America. She would eventually have to return home to South Korea to help take care of her sick husband, but her son would stay behind and continue to search for his sister. Weeks would pass, followed by months, and then finally a year had gone by with no new leads. That is until June of 2003, when a man by the name of Paul Weekly came forward claiming he knew exactly what happened to Cindy. He claimed that two men, Hugo Selinski and Michael Krakowski, had abducted Cindy in the early morning hours of November 1st, mistaking her for a prostitute. They took her back to Hugo's house where they kept her in a walk-in safe between the times that she was being assaulted, if you guys know what I mean. And eventually they just left her in the safe to pass on her own. But how exactly did Paul know this? And why did it take him over a year to come forward? Paul claimed that Selinski actually told him this. They were friends. They'd actually met in prison in 1995. Selinski would be released from prison in 2001, with Paul following in 2002, and Paul moved into Selinski's home. So in 2003, Paul was arrested on felony burglary charges and told his story to the police, thinking that it might help get him a lesser sentence. At the time that Paul was telling this story, Michael Krakowski had actually been a fugitive of justice since May of 2002. He'd gotten into trouble with the law by running a prescription drug ring out of his pharmacy. It was a great little side business, netting him over $800,000, but it was also highly illegal. He was eventually arrested and convicted on several felony charges, but before Krakowski's sentence could be handed down, he and his girlfriend, a woman by the name of Tammy Fassett, vanished. Paul claimed that Krakowski and Tammy did not vanish, that they were actually murdered by Selinski. Paul claimed that Krakowski and Fassett hadn't actually vanished, that they were murdered by Selinski and then buried on his property. You see, the story goes is that Krakowski had kept Cindy's bunny ears from that night, and Selinski got mad at this. He couldn't have any evidence leading him back to this crime. So he got enraged and killed Krakowski, and because Tammy was there, she became collateral damage. Paul would go on to say that Selinski was responsible in the deaths of 16 other people. So was this story true? Or was this something he was just making up in an attempt to get less prison time? Selinski had been a lifelong criminal, getting in trouble from a very young age. He'd actually tried to enlist in the Marines and was discharged twice, the first time for failing to appear at boot camp and the second time for, not telling the Marines that he had restitution charges that he owed to the juvenile court system. So was that really an attempt to clean his life up, or was he trying to gain more control and, coveted this position of being a Marine because he thought it would give him more power? Either way, once he was discharged from the Marines, he would continue his life of crime. He actually went on to commit a bank robbery with a friend at just 21 years old, and was caught and sentenced to 6 years and 10 months in federal prison in December of 1994. So while he's in prison, he meets his good pal, Paul Weekly, and they form a bond. So much so that when both men are released from prison, Paul would actually go and live with Selinski. So when all of this is going on, the police are looking into Paul. Now, they don't discount that he could have just made this up to, get a lesser sentence and point the finger at someone else. So focus would go off of him, but they wanted to know a little bit more about the man himself. And when they searched his computer, they were kind of baffled by what they found. See, they actually found that he had downloaded several articles having to do with Cindy's disappearance. And the skepticism that the police had continued to grow. Was this really about Cindy, or was this just a fabrication? But keep in mind, as I said earlier, there were no active leads coming in on Cindy's case. Her case had gone very cold. The media wasn't focusing on it much anymore, and police wanted to bring Cindy home, however that may have come. So they decide that they're going to check it out, even though they might not necessarily believe Paul. And they head out to Selinski's property. And what they found would leave their heads reeling. You see, on the property, just like Paul said, were the bodies of Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett, along with two known drug dealers as well as a fifth unidentified victim. Selinski was arrested on his property for charges of robbery, as well as an incident that he'd actually had with Krakowski's father in 2002 when he allegedly robbed him. Now, in October, he was charged with the death of the two drug dealers, so 2 out of the 5. And he would actually escape from prison a few days later, only to turn himself in 3 days after that. So when his case heads to trial, Selinski's lawyers are thinking, okay, how can we get him out of this? How are we going to, make sure that he is not charged with the murder of these two men? We've got it. We're going to plant enough reasonable doubt in the jury's minds so they cannot convict him on these murder charges. And that's exactly what they did. They tried to pin these crimes on Paul himself, saying that, Paul was just trying to cover for his own crimes, that he was actually the one that murdered these two men and placed them in the burn pit, that he was the one responsible for the remains found on the property. And when the jury returned from deliberations, the defense's strategy actually worked. They planted enough reasonable doubt that Selinski was not convicted of the murders, but was convicted of 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. So authorities immediately charged Selinski with the murders of Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett. Now they would also charge Paul Weekly. It turns out that Selinski and Weekly had worked together to murder Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett. And the motivation was apparently financially driven. They knew that Krakowski had all of this money from his illegal pharmaceutical drug ring that he was running, and they wanted it no matter the cost. So they murdered Krakowski to get it. And because Tammy was there at the time, they also murdered her to eliminate any witnesses. So Paul went on to testify against Selinski to avoid the death penalty and possibly have his sentence reduced. In 2015, Selinski was found guilty in the first-degree murders of Michael Krakowski and Tammy Fassett. And while the police could not verify the story of what happened to Cindy with Krakowski because he was deceased, they leaned heavily into this theory. They found no indication of Cindy on Selinski's property, but it was discovered that Selinski had actually moved to that location a few months after Cindy's disappearance. So Selinski could have possibly been the cause of what happened to Cindy and then, moved to a different location, which is why she has never been found. Cindy's family went on to give some of her DNA to the national database so it could be compared against missing persons or remains found. But to this day, no one can say what really happened to Cindy Song. So I'm curious if investigators went to search Selinski's property, the one that he was living at before he made that move. I don't know if they would have had enough evidence to do that. And, getting a judge to sign off on that might have been a little bit tricky, but I wasn't able to find that information probably because that was not done. If you have any information on the disappearance of Cindy Song, I will leave the number linked to the Ferguson Township Police Department. It is never too late to bring justice to a cold case. And with that being said, we have reached the end of another video. Now, I want to thank you guys so much for listening to Cindy's story today. If you have any information, please call the number linked in the description. Let me know what you think happened to Cindy that night. Do we think that Selinski actually did it? Do we think that someone else saw an opportunity? Or do we think that she just left on her own? It's not completely out of the realm of possibility, but I just don't see it as being probable. And while you are letting me know what you think happened to Cindy, be sure and hit that subscribe button as well as the post notifications bell so you will be informed of every time I post a new video. Guess what, guys? It's Wednesdays and Saturdays. It's Wednesdays and Saturdays. Just a spoiler alert. Also, be sure to leave any recommendations for what I should call this Halloween series down in the comments and any true crime books that I should read and focus on those cases. I'm going to go ahead and go. I smell chili, so yeah, it's cold outside. There's chili cooking. I hope you guys all have an amazing day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.